Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're digging into a really thought-provoking piece from Counterpoint. It just came out yesterday, May 24th, 2025.
That's right. It's titled Post-Yunus Bangladesh, An Unknown Destination. The author is Sultan Mohammad Zakaria.
And our goal, our mission for you in this deep dive is really to unpack the uncertainties. The assumptions swirling around what Bangladesh might look like if Professor Yunus steps down. Zakaria lays out some pretty complex scenarios.
He does. It's very much an analytical piece, focusing on that political landscape, the potential power shifts.
Okay.
It's less about prediction, more about mapping out the what-ifs.
Exactly. And he kicks things off using that famous Donald Rumsfeld quote. You remember the known knowns, known unknowns.
And the unknown unknowns, yes.
Right. And Zakaria suggests that if Yunus were to leave, Bangladesh could be heading straight into an era of those unknown unknowns.
So, okay, what's the core idea here for the listener? Well, fundamentally, it's about unpredictability, deep unpredictability. Zakaria argues that while different groups probably have their plans, their strategies, the actual fallout from Yunus stepping down could be, well, way more complicated and less foreseeable than anyone really thinks right now.
So the usual political math might not add up.
Precisely. We could be entering a phase where the outcomes are genuinely unknown. That's the key thing to grasp. A lot of unforeseen consequences might be on the horizon.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics. The article dives into what looks like the BNP's plan. Zakaria outlines it as basically teaming up with General Waqar.
Yeah, collaborating to form some kind of interim election time government.
And the idea is to hold elections pretty quickly, maybe 3 to 6 months down the line, hoping that puts them back in power.
That seems to be the thinking, yes. On the surface, kind of straightforward.
But, and this is a big but, Zakaria points out this plan rests on some pretty shaky ground, some big assumptions.
Huge assumptions. The first one he tackles is this idea that a whole bunch of other parties, the anti-BNP alliance, essentially.
Who are we talking about here?
He lists the NCP, Jamaat, Islami Endalan, Khilafat Majlis, the AB party, others. The assumption is they'll all just get on board, support this BNP Waqar plan, support the quick election.
Right. And Zakaria immediately questions that. He asks, well, why would they cooperate?
Exactly. He points out the BNP wasn't exactly supportive of the Yunus government or its reforms.
And there's an irony he mentions, isn't there?
Yeah.
That Waqar and the BNP's actions might actually be what forces Yunus out.
Potentially, yes. So Zakaria's question becomes, why would these other parties then turn around and help the BNP set up an election without those reforms they might have wanted? An election that could just put the BNP back in charge, restoring the old system.
Yeah, that doesn't quite add up, does it? It's a really sharp point.
It really is. And Zakaria labels this potential lack of cooperation as a key unknown. Are the BNP maybe too confident that these groups won't actively try to block them, to stop a return to power without real systemic change?
Because those groups might feel they'd just be sidelined again.
That could certainly be their motivation. So the big insight here for you is that the BNP's plan seems to depend on cooperation that, frankly, looks pretty unlikely given the recent past.
Okay, moving on. The second assumption Zakaria examines. It's the BNP's belief that even if that anti-BNP alliance doesn't play ball,
We can still pull it off.
right, just based on their own size and, crucially, with General Waqar's support.
And Zakaria acknowledges, yes, the BNP has a significant base, maybe 30-35% vote share, something like that.
But he balances that immediately. He says, okay, but that means 65-70% of the population remains wary, maybe even distrustful of them.
That's a major hurdle, a very large segment of the electorate.
And then he gets into their perceived strength on the streets,
Yeah.
their ability to mobilize, their street fighting force.
Yeah, he's quite critical here, actually. He brings up that big mobilization back on October 28th, 2023, in Dhaka. The BNP claimed huge numbers, over 1 million.
I remember that.
But, as Zakaria notes, the Sheikh Hasina government managed to disperse that crowd with, in his words, minimal force.
Not exactly a show of overwhelming power then.
Doesn't sound like it. And then there's that anecdote he shares about Barrister Madood Ahmed. Apparently, at a rally, someone asked him to call for a sit-in.
And what did he say?
He supposedly quipped that if the police just set off a few firecrackers, most of the crowd would probably run for it.
Wow. Okay, that paints a picture. It sort of undermines the idea of this really disciplined, immovable street force.
It certainly seems to. Zakaria contrasts this with what he sees as the more disciplined street presence of groups like the NCP and other Islamic forces.
So this leads him to another unknown unknown.
Exactly. What if those anti-BNP street forces decide to cause trouble, to actively disrupt the BNP's plans?
And could they have support?
He even floats the possibility of tacit support from within General Walker's forces. He makes a comparison to Ishraq's recklessness, though the article doesn't really elaborate on that specific reference.
Okay, but the general point is clear.
The point is the potential for disruption from unexpected quarters. So, for you listening, the takeaway is that the BNP's assumed strength on the ground, it might not be as solid as they think. Another big uncertainty.
And the crucial risk here, it seems, is instability. Widespread instability. Zakaria sort of sketches this scenario where you could have both sides trying to destabilize the government.
Right. Which throws everything up in the air. Would elections even happen? Could the BNP actually take power if things descend into chaos? Huge questions.
Which brings us neatly to the third big assumption Zakaria dissects. General Wakar himself?
Yes, the idea that he's just a neutral figure, no lingering ties to the Awami League, no major external connections influencing him.
And Zakaria really pokes at this with some what-ifs, doesn't he?
He does, really provocative ones, like what if Wakar actually wants to rehabilitate the Awami League somehow, bring them back into the fold, stabilize them?
Or what if he has strong ties across the border? That's usually code for India, right?
It often implies regional influence, yes. And these what-ifs open up a whole different set of possibilities, bringing in geopolitics.
And the implications are pretty significant. Zakaria asks, would external powers really ditch a known quantity, a proven ally like the Awani League potentially was?
For an untested one, like a BNP potentially aligned with Wakar, it's a fair question.
He also raises the prospect of direct intervention from outside. If these anti-BNP street forces pull back, could external actors step in to stabilize things?
He says you can't rule it out, especially given history in the region. So this adds yet another layer of these unknown unknowns. The assumption of Walker's neutrality and isolation might just be wishful thinking.
Okay, so Zakaria lays out all these potential problems, these uncertainties for the BNP's plan. Then he considers, well, what if all that's wrong? What's the simplest outcome?
And his simplest outcome is, well, it's quite bleak, actually.
How so?
He imagines a scenario where all those other assumptions are wrong. Everyone does fall in line with the BNP and Wakar.
Okay.
And this leads to what he calls a reformless zero-sum election. Basically, an election without any meaningful changes to the system.
And the result of that?
Zakaria fears it would just mean restoring the old system, a system he describes as one of plunder, where power is heavily concentrated, like under Sheikh Hasina, he suggests, but just with a different autocrat at the helm.
So no real change, just a change of faces at the top. And when he says plunder, he likely means?
He likely means that historical pattern we've seen, where concentrated power can lead to, corruption, lack of accountability, benefits flowing to a select few, a system serving the ruler, not necessarily the people.
And he makes a sharp point about reforms here, doesn't he?
He does. He argues, look, if the BNP really wanted to empower the people, wouldn't they have supported reforms? Reforms aimed at balancing power.
That's a strong critique.
And it leads him to ask, rhetorically, why would other political groups in Bangladesh just step aside? Just hand the country over for that kind of outcome, a return to the old ways.
It seems unlikely when you put it like that.
Which brings us back to the nature of politics itself. As Zakaria points out, it's about compromise, negotiation, give and take.
It's not winner takes all, usually.
Not if you want stability. And he suggests there's a key demand likely coming from that anti-BNP alliance, especially in a post-Yunus scenario. Proportional representation, PR, for parliament, both upper and lower houses if they exist.
Okay, and their argument for this?
Simple and quite powerful, really. Every vote must count. They're framing it as a demand that's much more people-friendly.
Because it gives smaller parties a real shot.
Exactly. Even if you only get, say, 1% of the national vote under PR, you could still potentially get seats in parliament. It ensures much broader representation.
And what if that demand isn't met? What if the BNP and Wakar say no to PR?
Well, Zakaria's analysis suggests the anti-BNP alliance would likely just sit out the election, boycott it.
Which would obviously damage the legitimacy of any government formed after that kind of election. Massively.
Absolutely. And then Zakaria adds this little twist. He calls it poetic justice.
Oh.
He floats the idea that if they did get proportional representation, the BNP, even with its 35% vote share.
Might actually end up being a minority party in parliament.
It's a distinct possibility, he suggests. Not a guarantee, but a fascinating potential outcome of the very reform the other parties are demanding.
Wow. Okay, so he wraps that section up by saying,
Just interesting times ahead, which, given everything he's just outlined, feels like quite an understatement.
definitely an understatement. So the key takeaway here for you, the listener, is that this demand for proportional representation throws another huge variable into the mix. It's not just about who leads, but about the very rules of the game.
Indeed. So let's try and pull this together. Zakaria's article, Post-Yunus, Bangladesh, an unknown destination. It really paints this picture of profound uncertainty.
Multiple layers of it.
He systematically takes apart the apparent BNP plan, showing how it relies on assumptions about cooperation, about street power, about General Wakhar's motives.
Assumptions that the author, Zakaria, finds highly questionable, really drills down on those.
Absolutely. The whole piece is threaded through with this theme of the unknown unknowns. How many factors are just unpredictable right now?
Yeah, it really emphasizes that the BNP's return isn't some kind of foregone conclusion. It's anything but straightforward.
Far from it. So this deep dive into Zakaria's analysis, it leaves us, and hopefully you, the listener, with a really critical question to chew on.
Which is?
Well, given this incredibly complex picture, all these unpredictable elements, the competing demands of proportional representation, what does a genuinely stable future for Bangladesh even look like? A truly representative one.
Beyond just the immediate question of who's in charge next week or next month.
Yeah. Exactly. Thinking longer term, what are the implications of these different paths Zakaria has laid out? Something definitely worth pondering.